everybody. I feel a little bad doing this tonight because I feel like it's a little disrespectful to the president who's giving the State of the Union right now. So, I don't know. I think we can get over that, though, maybe if we try. I'm super happy to be here interviewing John, being in conversation with John, because I know him from his work as a food writer in town. And, I work at Rainbow Grocery Cooperative. I've been the cheese buyer there for 23 years. And, when John would occasionally ask me a question, come in, ask me something about cheese or about our co-op, I was just always really impressed with his interest in the history of food movements, not just, our store, but just how we got there, how food got to where it is right now. And I was super happy when I found out when he told me that he was working on a book, which was, about 5 years ago? Yep. Yeah, okay. Because that's how long it takes, right?
Yep.
But earlier today I sent a list. We were having trouble connecting on the phone, so I was like, these are all my notes from reading your book. And I realized that I had sent him, after I sent it, about like 50 questions, basically. So there's absolutely no time for 50 questions and something like this, but there's plenty of stuff to discuss. So this is about all you're going to hear me talk tonight. Or, well, I don't know about that, but I'm going to try. But mostly we're going to talk to John about this great book, Hippie Food. So first I just want to ask you, what was your introduction to what we are calling hippie food? And maybe you want to define hippie food.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you guys for coming out. This is really delightful and exciting, and I'm so glad for the book to finally be out after 5 years of research. But in fact, the term hippie food, sort of, for me, that was like the working title for at least the first 4 years, and all of a sudden it became the actual title. Because when I would try to explain to people what I was working on or what I was interested in, if I was talking to people of my generation and younger, I would say, hippie food. It's like that stuff you find at a vegetarian restaurant, or you did, but you don't find anymore. But when I was talking to baby boomers, I'd bring up the word hippie, and some people would get really upset with it. So I wanted to acknowledge at first that for some people, hippie is a real slur. I had several people lecture me. I had one person not wanting to talk to me, but then, but for me, hippie food is a lot of the food I grew up with. So tofu stir fries with broccoli and lentil stews and whole wheat bread and sprouts and yogurt and granola and all of these foods that I had really stopped paying attention to by the time I was in my teens. And then when I became a cook and at first when I became a restaurant critic, it was just sort of the food that was like, I wasn't interested in it. I was more interested in sort of cooking higher end food. And it wasn't until about maybe 10 years ago when I was in Seattle, when I went to a vegetarian restaurant that had been around for 30 years, and it just was like, had all this food that brought up all these memories for me, and it made me start wondering, made me start thinking of it actually as a cuisine that was like that was based in time, that maybe had a start and maybe had an end, and then wonder what its origins were. So.
Before we start talking more about what you wrote, I just want to get a sense of how you started writing. And I know that's like the typical question to ask, but I'm really curious because you're a writer for the Chronicle as your day job, and then you wrote a book as your other job, right? So, but how did you end up down that path from growing up as a kid in Indiana?
Well, it was total luck. My parents, loved to remind me over and over again that I was the pickiest eater ever. And so they're continually surprised by my career in many ways. But I kind of had a conversion to great food sort of in restaurants, and I worked in restaurants through college and moved out to San Francisco and began working in restaurants here, and realized that I didn't want to work in restaurants for the rest of my life. And So I was taking a few years to figure out what I was going to do next, and I was editing and learning to become a copy editor and working in a nonprofit. And a friend of mine worked at the East Bay Express and said, "Hey, they're looking for freelance writers to write about food. Why don't you write something?" And so I kind of did on a whim, and I turned it in, and they bought it, and then they assigned me another piece, and they bought that, and within a couple of years, they'd hired me, and that was 18 years ago. So.
It's easy as that, everybody.
Right.
Easy as that. I have a funny, quick Seattle question. So, did you ever eat at the Globe restaurant when it was in existence?
No.
The Globe restaurant was definitely a hippie food restaurant that my friend cooked at, but the owner had this really odd idea, and the cooks were not allowed to use spices because, according to the owner, poor people can't afford spices. Right. Which
wow.
I'm not saying that. I'm repeating that. And it was one of the worst restaurants I've ever had. And I lived across the street from Real Good Karma in San Francisco for years too. But let's talk, because I'm from the Bay Area and we're here in San Francisco, and we have to ask, like, what is the Bay Area's like special impact on hippie food? Because obviously I think there's a large one and there's an ongoing one.
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
Well, the Bay Area is so connected with the idea of the counterculture and with anything involving counterculture that when I was first trying to pitch publishers and agents on this, I mean, the question I got so often was, well, isn't this just a California thing? And I kept having to say to them, I grew up in Indiana, in a small town where we had a food co-op in 1976, 77, and I was eating all of this food. And that's sort of part of my quest, is to figure out how my parents were eating all this. But when I looked, I could have really set most of the book in the Bay Area, because there was so much happening on every front, and the Bay Area ended up playing this role that was almost the intellectual center of the hippie food movement, or what I call hippie food movement. It was the place where one of the very first natural food stores opened that we would sort of recognize. That was New Age Natural Foods that opened in the Inner Sunset in 1965. There was a small macrobiotic community here early on that ended up influencing people. Frances Moore Lepay, who wrote Diet for a Small Planet, which to me is one of the sort of essential books that really changed the conversation around food. She was based in Berkeley. There's a really active organic movement that started up in California at the same time as it did in a few other states, and that was based in Santa Cruz, and it was certainly happening with all the Back to the Landers in the North Bay. And the publishers, Shambhala and 10-Speed Press, put out a number of the cookbooks that ended up becoming sort of the cooking Bibles for a lot of people for this new cuisine.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most fascinating things about the book to me, and this, if people don't know, Rainbow was the place that I work and has been around, started with these food movements of the 60s and 70s. Some people would say it was founded by a cult. It hasn't been for quite some time, but we were incorporated, and as I got the job there almost 24 years ago, and we were still incorporated as a not-for-profit religious institution.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. We're a worker-owned cooperative incorporated in the state of California now, but yeah, no, it's true. And I'm not here to talk about that, but just what do you... Well, I mean, we could. Right? Later, like after.
Rainbow's amazing.
It just seems like things that we might call cults or, fringe religions or sects of established religions had a lot to do with being the foundations of these kind of new food movements, or at least part of the pillars that supported it. And I think that really comes through in the book, but I just think that it'd be interesting to hear what you think about that. That was when I was reading it, I was like, oh, here's another, religious group that did this really important thing.
Well, I think they were important in two ways, and one way is that alternative religions, new religions, cults, were many of them ended up being connected to vegetarian or sort of embracing a vegetarian diet at a time when really America, it was so fringe. I mean, the vegetarian, the history of vegetarian cooking in America really starts in around 1830s with Sylvester Graham, and then is carried through on the backs of the Seventh-day Adventists for about 100 years. So you had people who were influential in the sense of a lot of the Vedanta societies, the Theosophists, a number of Indian folks who were interested in Indian spiritual traditions embraced vegetarianism along with it. And then there were also the cults like the Source family, who I wrote about, who were not connected to any of those traditions, but was a group of people who, led by a man they called Father Yod, and there were 150 of them, and they lived together in a big mansion, and all dressed in white, had long flowing hair. He had 13 wives at one point. And they adopted a raw foods diet that was based on an apocryphal gospel that may or may not have been invented by a Hungarian academic who made it to Mexico, in the 1940s, and he was advocating a raw food diet with with toast. So, so there was. I think so much.
That doesn't sound strange to me at all.
Okay.
I mean,
that's very familiar in some ways. I think it was because so many people were looking for new worldviews, and before what I call hippie food had a shape, it was a quest for a lot of different things, and some of those had very spiritual tint. And so I think they were embracing a lot of things on the fringe, and vegetarianism was definitely on the fringe back then.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, I still work at the store every day, so I have been there a long time. When I first started, before I worked at the store, I lived somewhere else, I shopped at the co-op there. That's where you had to get natural foods.
Yeah.
You had to go find a co-op. And you definitely don't have to do that anymore. And it's funny, because as a buyer of food, a professional buyer of food, I kind of like it when an organization is just a little bit culty or religious, because
how culty?
Well, there is a line. There's
definitely.
I don't have it quantified, but there is a line because there's for us what carried on is this belief in right livelihood, and I'm not a very spiritual person, but I do think that doing right in the world is a important thing, and I think that a lot of the companies, when you deal with those companies, they're willing to they don't compromise on things. It's high quality for whatever they're into, and it's a lot of times as a buyer, I mean, I'd rather deal with some kind of little fringy group than I would just an absolute capitalist concern, because I know that probably that group's going to be around for a while, where somebody else may be just looking to sell it off to the highest bidder as soon as they become a little profitable. So, I mean, I guess the question here, and there is one, is that, how do you reflect on the way that natural foods has changed from being a very fringe movement to now being something that is, publicly traded?
Yeah.
And big business.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so much of the food co-op movement, the motto that just people, I'd start talking about food co-ops with people who were born in or who were part of that movement, and first thing that came out of their mouths was food for people, not for profit. That was this motto that really the entire food co-op system embraced, and it was because they weren't just trying to get sources for all of this food, all of these sort of novel fringe foods like, tofu for them, or brown rice, or grains. They were trying to create an anti-capitalist or post-capitalist economy that was based on these communal values and was definitely antithetical to the idea of making money. And so that is what, for me, it was the engine that really drove the spread of the movement to all of these places like Elkhart, Indiana, was because they were trying to get this food and then get it to people cheap for low prices. But it also, when the 80s rolled around and real estate prices started going up, and this whole system of food co-ops that was based on volunteer labor. They got older, they started having kids, they had to make a little bit more money, and then they're also in the business, like one of the lowest profit margin industries in the entire United States. The food co-ops just fell apart, with the exception of about 300 that made it through the gauntlet of the 80s and 90s, including Rainbow. And the only ones, and the reason they did is because they sort of dropped enough of their volunteer ways, and they learned sort of important things like you have to pay people a reasonable wage so they can continue to work for you, and you have to put up enough markup on your products so that you can pay your rent. You have to use an actual bookkeeper instead of
Whoever didn't come to the meeting.
Right.
Yeah. You're assigned the bookkeeping role. You weren't here. That's fairly standard way bookkeeping got divided. Not in our story.
At the same time, there was all the for-profit industries, the grocery industry sniffed out the profit potentials really early on. And so, grocery stores started introducing, they first picked up granola, and cereal companies made a lot of money from it, and yogurt got embraced, and whole wheat bread ended up on grocery store shelves. And so there's this competition that just did not exist before. And so after 1980, the story of the natural food movement is kind of dull. I ended the book in 1980 because I just couldn't. It just was all acquisitions and so.
Well, that brings me.
Did that even get to that?
No, that brings me to the biggest peeve I had of the book, which is there wasn't enough cheese in there. Right? And but it's interesting, as someone who works with cheese people all the time, it was the seeds of the 60s and 70s that really made it so today we have this artisan cheese, whatever we want to call it, movement thing, market share, that is very different from the way it was, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And none of that started happening until the 80s. I mean, I'm being a little, exaggerating, but
it was back to the landers who started doing it.
Exactly. And the thing that is actually really interesting, I mean, there's lots of interesting things about back to the landers to me, but if you look at farming and the way that it usually works, it's family succession, right? What happens to farms? The kids take over the farm, right? With the back to the landers, we don't necessarily see that.
Right.
And that's also really affecting who's farming and the acquisitions and that kind of stuff as well. If you don't have a family member who wants to take it on, what do you do?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, but the other thing about the back to the landers that was so interesting is that they were a generation who had no idea about farming. Most of them, some of them did. And it was this huge out-migration from the cities that you can see in census data. And I had never realized it was so big because it just, all these little scattered folks going to tiny towns all over the country. But especially in cities in states like Vermont, I mean, there's these big jumps. And so they profited from the fact that land in those rural areas was so cheap. And it was, and partly because there was a huge ex-migration from rural areas to the cities. So they were settling in areas where all of the kids had left to make more money. So they were able to take advantage of this. And then when the real estate boom of the 80s happened, then their land all of a sudden became valuable.
Absolutely. Well, and also what I think is really interesting about these food movements of the 60s and 70s is that it was like a pushback against 100 years of industrialization of the food supply, but also the depopulation that was caused by the industrialization of the food supply, that there was land, that there was a way to do this. And, this is what I was looking into when I wrote Cheddar, but to me, it was like this real embrace that started with these that is kind of the, what I usually call the beauty of inefficiency, because for 100 years, the American food system was based on efficiency. How can we get, I'm in cheese, so I'm always good at it. How can we get the most protein for the cheapest amount of money into the store for the cheapest price? And the important thing about what we're calling hippie foods here, and what I usually would say the 60s and 70s food movements, is that they were pushing back against that.
In so many ways. I mean, it was aesthetic. It was sort of motivational. I mean, the harder the better. I had heard several times, the more you had to chew, the better we thought the food was for you. It was
and alienation to the food supply. I mean, I think that's one thing that I constantly hear about from the people who before me in this food world, they talk about it was people's alienation to the food they were eating.
And I think that's still happening. You know, I mean, there was this so much of the movement for me was about taking control. It was about taking control of your food supply, knowing exactly where your food is coming from, and the way they wanted to do that was to take it back to whole grains, and then which you grind for flour, and then you bake your own bread, and that way you could be sure of its purity. And what's interesting to me now is that Molly Katzen said to me that, you know, one of the that Moosewood Cookbook is selling really well with folks who are almost survivalists or preppers, I think, are they called? But you know, and I actually talked to somebody like on like a radio interview last week who was talking about his far right cousin who was really interested in organics and gardening and whole grains. It's you know, this isn't necessarily just a liberal left, you know, urban elite movement. I mean, I think the same fears and desires that drove it continue to motivate people today.
Yeah, I remember seeing it was a documentary on the Oklahoma City bombing, and this was from a few years ago, and it was like, I can't remember exactly the context, but I think it was basically like Timothy McVeigh's like brother or cousin or whatever. It was like, oh, they were going to his organic soybean farm to like find him. And I was like, it's like, well, that just shows you that it's not just a liberal urban thing. I mean, kind of the exact opposite. Changing the subject a little bit, you know, one of the things I think is really interesting about Americans and the way they eat food is the way that food fads have come and gone over the years. And I mean, there's, you know, we're talking about the graham cracker. I mean, you're going to get to explain all this. But like, you know, talk about like from the graham cracker to like the Shangri-La diet to all this. And to me, it doesn't seem like what we're calling hippie foods here was just a fad. It seems more than that to me. But how would you describe that?
So I think my favorite part of the research was getting to the pre-counterculture stuff, the pre-1960s stuff, because what I ended up finding was however loopy folks could be in the 1970s, and I heard some great stories, they ended up being a lot saner than some of the sources they were pulling material from. And so there was this, I totally fell in love with the health food movement from Southern California from 1910 through 1960. And LA became this real magnet for anybody who had any new idea about health and nutrition. And they even had, they had an alternative medicine column in the Los Angeles Times that started in 1899 and went for 40 years. And it's amazing. Like if you have 30 minutes and you're looking through the San Francisco Public Library database, so you can get access to all of the LA Times historical issues, pretty amazing. So they were like the raw foods diet was introduced to the United States around 1915. There were 2 raw foods restaurants they called themselves unfired foods in the United States in Southern California by like 1920, 1930. And because there was this sort of pseudoscience. The pseudoscience is kind of shadowing every nutritional movement from like, you know, the 1800s on. And so because they had just heard about vitamins, they knew vitamins were important, and there were all of these wild ideas about what vitamins can do for you, but then there were all these other things they didn't really know about, and so they sort of made up explanations for how they would be beneficial to you. So there was this obsession with vitality and with miracle cures and with wonder foods, which we all know as superfoods now, and so they like all of these shadowy ideas that sort of have ended up in our diets. Like for example, vitality ended up in our diet in the form of fertile eggs, which they believed were more nutritious than unfertilized eggs. They believed that mineral salts were devitalized, and so they introduced all of these salt substitutes based on seaweed like spike. They embraced these wonder foods like wheat germ and yogurt and molasses, and they created, another alternative salt substance was Bragg's liquid amino acids. So all these foods that I'd grown up around and sort of ascribed to the counterculture had to do with these other ideas about what food was good for you. Yeah.
Well, to go back to the science thing for a second, one of the things I think is fascinating, again, with the history of American food is, science, these, like we said, we get these things like germ theory. We get these things like vitamins. They're very important things. But we also see science really used, especially, well, I don't want to draw a line necessarily, but certainly in the 50s and early 60s as a way to market. And that science, was that really science? I don't know. I mean, when I was doing research, I found this great ad, and it was like, hey, I'm paraphrasing. It was basically like, hey, Europe, you might have invented cheese, you might have invented Parmigiano Reggiano, you might have invented brie, but you know what? Scientists here in America, we developed Velveeta, so you know what?
Yeah.
Off the stage of history, your time is done, right? I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that is literally like, well, that is not literally. That is what, that was the message they were sending. So I think a lot of this stuff was also pushing it back, and there's a lot of pseudoscience in hippie food. I will not deny, but there's also some reasonable pushing back against science used incorrectly to market things. Did you feel like do you feel like what I'm saying is true? Or?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was more what I was seeing was I was looking at sort of the response to the natural food movement, and any fad diet was sort of science was going to combat it, and we still hear that today. And maybe the science is more sophisticated now. But there were the main opponent to the organic movement and the sort of the public jouster against organics and natural foods was Frederick Stair, who was a Harvard nutritionist, and he wrote a couple books, including the Panic in the Pantry. He and this other nutritionist named Elizabeth Whelan, and they would say things like, chemicals are our friends. You should look at food additives as your friends. And organic, all chemicals are organic. So how can you say that some chemicals are bad for you? And sugar and soda and meat could be part of a healthy diet as long as you eat a balanced diet. And now recently it's come to light that he was funded by the sugar industry, and so they're questioning a lot of his studies and certainly a lot of his pronouncements of that time. But yeah.
Another thing you kind of touched on, I'm going to sum it up by saying there was always these tensions in these food movements that was kind of taste versus health. Like, I think that it's like, it doesn't matter if it tastes good if it's healthy, or where we're at now, which is a real, development, especially in San Francisco, or the Bay Area of it has to taste good or else, forget it, right? And then this other tension that's like, especially in the co-op world of the time, which was we need to teach the masses how to eat and eat healthy versus the masses want Twinkies and Cokes and we should provide those at a cheap price, right? So I don't know. Those seem to be the two parallel tensions always when we talk about this.
I think one of the things when I was researching the book that I kind of ended up forgiving my parents' generation for some of the food. In that, one, I realized how young they were. I mean, not necessarily my parents, but a lot of the people, who were really engaged in this revolution. But I started thinking about all of the foods that they were making, all of the bean casseroles with sprouts and this sort of, the super heavy dour food. It was because they were it was function over form. I mean, they were creating a new diet for themselves, and it was going to be healthier, and it was going to be ecologically more sensitive, and it was going to have all of these, it was going to be politically more responsive, but none of them knew how to cook anything with it. And so, of course, the first 10 years when they're trying out all these ingredients, what they're going to be making is really not good. And so it really took the entire 1970s that's what I think. I mean, I think it took the entire 1970s for them to figure out how to cook this stuff. And they also had access to whatever you could find in a natural food store at the time, which was not much. And the vegetables that you could get, in small towns everywhere, which, were nothing like the selection today. So that's why I think the food today is so much better, is because we have access to so much more experience and ingredients. But Yeah. Anyway, so there's that. But then the whole the pure food versus cheap food versus good food debate is still going on, you know. But there were in several major metropolitan areas where they had co-op networks, like San Francisco, the People's Food System, and in Minneapolis in particular. Those debates over what a food co-op should be, what people want. What should we stock on the shelves? Like long, torturous meetings over whether we should carry cashews, or sugar, or chocolate. Like they erupted into all-out battles involving physical violence, which is, I mean, fascinating. But you know we still haven't resolved it. I mean, I think that in some ways it was resolved because the co-ops that stuck around were the ones that adapted in order to make a profit, in order to survive. But, we're still fighting the same battles now.
Absolutely. Moving on, the one thing I was really struck with the book, too, is I don't think that there was a single bigger thing that helped change food in this country. I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating, but it seems to me that the farmer's market and the resurgence of the farmer's market is the single biggest thing that brought food that changed the way that we eat in this country over the last 40 years. Would you think that's accurate, or am I being overly?
I don't know. I mean, I think the natural food market probably had a lot. Just sort of that network, the infrastructure, the sort of the not sexy part of the distributors and trucking and things like that. But what I was really surprised by the farmers market, like how much of it sprung out of back to the lander ideals and back to the lander communities, because it was this way that, at least in Vermont, when I was writing about, which I really focus on for the Back to the Lander / organic farming chapter, they were looking for ways, anti-capitalist ways that would, sort of escape the supermarket in order to preserve, create these economic communities and social communities around food, and bring food from the farmer that to the, to the food co-op where you're involved in, or to you yourself, the buyer, and just how much those ideals are embedded in the whole farmers market movement.
Mm-hmm. I think too that as and the way it's adapted today, I think all that is true too. But I also think that it almost acts as a practice ground too for people making food today, especially in the cheese world. I mean, one of these sad things is that cheese that I would buy 24 years ago when I started, people would buy it. Like customers would come and buy it, and we all knew it wasn't very good. I mean, it was not. It wasn't. Up to a lot of standards. It was like different every time. It was all this kind of stuff. But those products never get on the shelf anymore, because there's so many people who have gone back and made these more quality products, and they've had now sometimes 30, 40 years of making them, and they're really good and they're really consistent and all that. So I think that farmers markets also still to this day are providing an outlet for farmers and rural producers to try out their products and sell it to a friendly audience before if they decide to get bigger as well. But I was also, when I was reading the statistics in the book, I was really like, wow, I didn't realize it had really dwindled that much. And, of course, there's the whole thing of the fake farmer's market too, which is like, it's a farmer's market, but none of the actual sellers are selling stuff. It's just stalls and stuff like that, which I think there's a lot of rules about that stuff in most places now, where they have to actually have some relation to farmers.
But back in 1970, there wasn't. I mean, there were only maybe 200 something farmers markets around, and most of them were places like that where you could you were a reseller. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I also love. I mean, I think today food co-ops and natural food stores are still a testing ground for a lot of new products, and also in every new dietary movement that kind of sweeps through the country. Like, I mean, where do you go when you're looking for paleo products? I mean, you're going to sort of a natural food store or a food co-op because, you're just the early adopters of everything.
Okay, totally changing the subject here because we all want to know this answer, right? So give us a crazy story that wasn't in the book. Like some kind of story of some stuff you didn't necessarily want in print. No one's listening. It's just me and you. Might have involved an orgy. Might have involved drugs.
Oh, man.
No.
I did try and document have proof for most of what I was writing, so that did kind of, more of it, it was more like all of the little stories that popped up that I just couldn't work into the book because I didn't necessarily have a character, but there was like the organic farmer in Vermont who was telling me about, how he was a macrobiotic for a while, but his idea of macrobiotics was brown rice and LSD. Or there was this...
Show me where that's wrong.
So there was this other woman, Vermont was great. I loved the Back to the Landers. All of them. This woman who was telling me about the time she decided to move to Vermont from Iowa, and she had some goats, and so she knocked out the two back seats of her car, and she put in some hay bales, and then she shoved the goats in there, and she drove across the country, and then she lived in a commune where they would go out into the field every morning to commune with the aliens. People led amazing lives back then.
Bring it back to today. Do you think? I think that a lot. It depended on what areas we're talking about here, but a lot of the things that we call hippie food, or the food movements of the '60s and '70s, a lot of them were very white. A lot of them, and I think that today we're seeing a lot of political action around food justice that is in people of color communities. Do you think that there is a link between the two? Do you think it's unlinked? What do you think? How do you think this era applies to today?
I think one of the really frustrating parts of researching the book was to realize how white the movements could be in most of the cities and areas. Because I think that, with the exception of the Bay Area, it made me feel very good, about where I lived, to know that the Bay Area was one of the few areas where, the People's Food System, which was the natural food movement, they were inspired by what was happening in Oakland with the Black Panther movement. There weren't necessarily a lot of connections between them, but because a lot of the food co-ops were in the Mission, there was a real effort to make sure that they had Spanish speakers on staff, that people who were involved in the store could speak Spanish, were from the communities who were settling in the Mission at the time. There was a really active Asian American movement as well, and I think the movement, people who were involved in the food movement here came from many more backgrounds, and had a lot more consciousness around race and class than in a lot of areas where I read report after report of food co-ops that would open up in areas that were largely Black or Latino, and you'd have people writing, "Well, I don't understand why nobody from the community comes here. It's just long-haired hippies," without necessarily investigating, well, what is it we're doing in our store? Who do we have at the staff? What are we stocking? What are we, how are we doing outreach to the communities around us to make sure that everybody is welcome in this place? And I think that some of those questions weren't really asked until very recently in some food co-ops and natural food stores. I think the food justice movement that is happening today, I think there's a direct line of contact with a connection between the Black Panthers and the survival programs that they were having, including free breakfast. I think there's a direct line of contact with folks like Dick Gregory, who in the 1960s and 70s adopted a vegan raw foods diet, and largely inspired by the Vietnam War, and was really asking people to look at how the diet that they were being fed by sort of the majority society, the majority economy, was impacting their health, and also the diet, that was being the soul food, the movement to embrace African American cuisine from the South could also be poisoning their bodies. So there was so much interesting stuff that was happening in the '60s, but it wasn't always connected directly to this other natural food movement that was so focused on whole grains and sort of pure food and organic vegetables.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, no, totally. And it's funny because we actually, I was having a discussion with some workers at the store today, and we're actually, okay, well, we're going to plan for next year. We're going to have like look at some of that stuff. These were people who've been there a lot longer than me, but who were like, we're gonna get to the roots of this, and we're gonna put on our own like panel next year. We'll see what happens. But it's fascinating discussion. And I'm getting the sign for one last question.
Oh, wow.
So
All right.
can you believe it's over already?
God.
It's very close. Oh, and then, yes, sorry. And then we're going to have Q&A. So if you, back there in the back, if you want to get ready to ask a question, go on back there. But my last question to you, hey, hello. My last question to you is, I guess just describe, I think one of the real themes of the book, too, is finding community in food. That a lot of these groups, organizations, whatever, a lot of it was about building community, either where they lived or across country based on interests. But how have you found community in food personally, and how does it relate to your thoughts about the book?
Oh man, that is a big.
You want to go back to the orgy question?
I mean, on a personal level, I think that to me, there's still. I personally love being around the table with people. I think that's sort of there's something really wonderful and magical that happens when you're at the same dinner table with people for 2-3 hours talking and not looking at your phones. And I think that in a lot of the writing I do for the Chronicle, I do. A lot of the restaurants that I'm drawn to write about are touchstones for communities around them. And there's this sort of relationship for people between what they're eating and memory and identity and community that I find just so compelling that I can't not want to write about it. And I think there was definitely that aspect. That was another thing that I think that I learned from the counterculture food movement, was that how much about community it was for people. And when I'd talk to back to the lander farmers, and I was like, tell me what you were looking, what was your ideal, what were you sort of trying to do? And they were like, well, we just think about, we think about these meetings, or we think about, where we were living, it was really about the people around us and building these very personal connections to everybody and everything that we were growing and everybody around us.
That's a great answer. Now we are going to go into some Q&A. Are you ready for the Q&A?
All right.
Okay.
I'm ready.
And we had a definition of what a question was earlier. Does everybody remember that? Okay, I can't really see very well back there, but whoever's up there first.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm just curious to know what your thoughts are on the juicing craze.
So juicing actually goes back to Southern California again. The Bragg family like to make the claim that they were the ones to bring juicing to the United States. The Bragg family behind Bragg's liquid amino acids, they make a lot of claims, and none of which I could substantiate. Actually, I could have gone into that story. They wouldn't meet with me. So juicing was only, I think juicing came to America through Southern California, and the reason it did, I think, was because it was one of the first areas where they had a ready access to fresh fruits and vegetables year round, and you could not have sort of promoting juicing as the healthiest way to drink, to eat, in Michigan in 1930. What do I think about it, like nutritionally, or? I think there's a lot of sugar in juice, and so I don't necessarily drink a lot of fruit juice. I also think fiber is a very good thing, and I like to get a lot of it in my own body. But they're very tasty.
This is where you should say, I'm not a doctor.
Right. I'm not a doctor.
Next question back there.
Hi there. I'm curious to know more about your process for writing the book, and particularly in the early years. So when you were pitching it, what exactly were you pitching it? Was it an idea? Was it an outline? Was it a partially written book? And then when it became a real thing, how did you balance it against the work that you continued doing for the Chronicle? Like, what was the structure of your days and your weeks?
Work. So I came up with the idea originally and an outline with the help of my very dear friend Kara, who's right here. And when I was talking to agents, came up with how I wanted to do it was I broke it down into chapters because I knew that if I had a chapter, it just seemed like a very long feature story. And because it was history and historical, everything I was looking at was sort of either an oral history or documents. I didn't feel a certain time pressure to finish the story when I did. So I really tried to make one chapter, put together one chapter that would sort of show how I was going to use personal stories to tell this sort of large, amorphous grassroots movement, and also prove to myself how would I tell this story. And then after that, once I sold the book, it really was, just evenings and weekends for a long time. And luckily, I got 2 months off to finish writing the book, and that really helped me pull everything together.
Next question.
What are some bad recommendations for diets like, keto and Whole30 and, the whole water and cayenne pepper thing? What would you suggest?
That we not do, or that we do? Or?
What would you suggest that we don't do?
I became even more convinced after spending 5 years reading about this, hippie food, that just the general guidelines of eat lots of whole grains, eat more vegetables and fruit, eat less meat, eat less to no sugar, have a balanced diet. That just seemed like the most sensible thing. It still seems like the most sensible way to eat for me. I think that I actually sort of am more of a with dictionaries? It's like you the prescriptive and descriptive. I'm much more of a descriptive person. I tend to think that if you're very conscious about your eating and not too conscious, that it rules out pleasure. That any changes you're making that make you conscious of what you're eating in a society like ours, where we're bombarded with information, and bombarded with sales pitches, means you're going to eat more healthfully. I don't know. Maybe I'm also an optimist too.
Next question.
So you've mentioned a lot of hippie foods like granola, yogurt, tofu that have crossed totally into the mainstream, and now we can get at any grocery store and everyone eats them, not only hippies. But were there any hippie foods that didn't make it, that are completely forgotten back in the annals of the era you're describing in your book?
I got one for you.
Oh, you do? Okay, go for it.
TVP. Remember
Yes,
TVP?
TVP, you can still find it.
You can still buy it.
You could wheat germ.
Textured vegetable protein.
Textured vegetable protein. Yeah. Oh, and it was
awful.
It was really bad. Alfalfa sprouts haven't done so well recently. My least favorite as a kid was carob. And when I talk to anybody who's my age, we're all traumatized by carob.
But recently you made some carob cookies.
But I did. I made some carob cookies.
I tried to get him to make carob cookies for everyone tonight, but he refused.
Carob chips taste exactly as horrible as I remember when I was 6 or 7.
Next question.
Hi. I was just wondering what you think about the way forward in terms of the affordability of these types of foods that we're talking about, because I buy a lot of it, but I see that as a privilege that I have. And I was just wondering what you think about where you see it going in the future, and things that you've observed as your journey in terms of writing the book and stuff.
Well, you're getting into my 60-second thing I was going to talk about. I
have to come up with a new one.
I'm not a purist. I'm kind of, I think that small solutions and big solutions, small money, small business solutions and big business solutions aren't antithetical to each other. I think for me, when I sort of think about my priorities are getting healthy food to everyone who can, and it's because I believe that diet has a huge effect on health. I'm not a doctor. And I also believe that we need to, farm in a way that's much more sustainable ecologically. But I think that there are a lot of ways to do it, and a lot more ways to do it. I'm actually, the thing that I'm most excited about right now is all of the restaurant chains like Dig In or Sweet Green or Local that are trying to find a way to make fast food that is very healthy. Because I think we're not going to change the way it's a lot harder to sort of change people's schedules so that they can free up time to cook all of this beautiful food. So why not make it so much more convenient for everybody? And I have another part of that answer too.
We're fine. Okay. Yeah, we got time for a couple more questions. So sorry. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so I know one really important thing is basically teaching kids at a young age how to eat healthy. And being in public school, I knew that oftentimes I felt like I was kind of getting two mixed messages where the food they were providing was crap, but they were telling us to eat healthy. So do you see that the hippie food movement either did start to change public schools or the government and the way they view food, and even if there's a future for that?
So that's basically the spoiler for my last chapter. Believe it or not. Yeah, the biggest, I think the biggest legacy of the natural foods movement for me was that they convinced the government and academic nutritionists on their idea of what health is. And so all of those things that I was saying about a balanced diet, about less sugar, more fruits and vegetables, more whole grains, those are part of the USDA dietary recommendations. And the way that those recommendations, which most of us ignore, are implemented are in school food that I see just sort of visibly. I mean, it's in the book, but I went to a taste test that Revolutionaries Foods was holding at a school in Chinatown, and what they were serving, the kids, as a sort of a menu item they were adding, was exactly the food that I grew up eating. So I have this hope that if the educational system, through regulation or force or however, is introducing kids to these tastes and these ways of eating, that in 20 years that they will have a much bigger effect. But I'm also, like I said, I'm an optimist.
Next question. There's only two of you back there still with questions. Yeah, we'll get both of you because there's only two left. Yeah.
So I'm really interested in your parents. I mean, were they typical of 1970s Midwest? I don't think so. That's my stereotype. So were they reading books, or they have a community of people who are doing these things, or?
So yeah, I have kind of a unique background in that I grew up Mennonite. But I grew up liberal Mennonite, which is even a smaller subset of a small subset. My parents' generation were kind of the first to go to college and to move away from rural areas, and we settled. I mean, the small city where I grew up, Elkhart, Indiana, is kind of one of the two population hubs for Mennonites in the United States. And so in 1976, there was this cookbook that came out called More with Less. And it combined all of these whole foods ideas and ideas about living lightly on the earth with these recipes from Mennonites who had spent time doing relief projects abroad. And so it was this very internationally influenced brown food. And so it was the food that all of my colleagues were, all of my kindergarten colleagues were eating.
Your cohort.
My cohort. And so all my friends were eating this food, and my parents were, I was lucky that my mom still liked sugar, and so we actually would have pies and cinnamon rolls, and so they weren't doctrinaire, but that for me was also part of the interest because they weren't hippies. I've gotten to talk to a number of people my age who grew up on communes who did full bore, not having sugar for years, and I feel very grateful.
All right, this is the last question here.
I was struck by a comment near the beginning of the discussion that there wasn't enough about cheese.
He's a ringer, isn't he?
I've never met this man.
Back in the 70s, at the height of the co-op food movement, there was a number of supplier co-ops, including People's Bakery and Veritable Vegetable, which still survives, and my personal favorite, Red Star cheese. Do you have any stories about connections between Red Star or other elements of the food system that are related to the flourishing artisanal cheese movement that we see here in Northern California?
Well, just so for those of you who don't know about the people's food system, and there were systems like this all over in cities, in college towns and cities around. It wasn't just for a lot of people, it wasn't just a matter of setting up a food co-op. They set up all these other businesses. So there were collectively run bakeries and herb shops and cheese brokers, and more importantly, there were warehouses, and trucking companies, and so they built this entire infrastructure for getting this food all over the country. And that's how I was eating it in Indiana, was because of infrastructure, stuff like that. I don't have any specific things around, Red Star.
I met somebody from Red Star for the first time at a co-op conference. She works at a different co-op in Washington State, I think now. And there, as far as I know, there was no direct connection to that. They were making more commodity-style cheeses, whereas the artisan food movement is more handmade cheeses. I will say that my favorite name from the people's food system, though, is the company that never got off the ground, which is because it collapsed before it could start, but it was going to be Left Wing Poultry, which was the
Yes.
I mean, that was the best.
There are some
So it is time to wrap up, and it's a tradition at these talks to ask the genius who's sitting next to me, whatever genius occupies the seat, their 60-second plan to change the world.
All right.
So what is it?
Okay.
Right now.
Talking quick. All right. So this is my. So one of the things that was that I really spent a lot of time was looking at how food was politicized. I'm talking very fast.
It doesn't have to really be 60 seconds.
This idea that our consumer choices have political impacts, and I think that was a very important part of that movement. But it also has meant that folks on the left, like me, tend to load up our food with every ideal that we have. And so we want it to be grown the right way and slaughtered the right way and processed the right way and baked the right way and sold the right way. And the result of that is that our food is going to be more expensive. And so I think a lot of people make the argument, well, people just need to pay more for food. And that to me is a very unsatisfying answer. In fact, I'm very frustrated by it, because I think that there's a certain smugness about that, and it ends up being used to passively and actively criticize people who can't make those decisions. So for me, the question isn't why aren't people paying more for food? It's why aren't we paying people more? And I think the organic movement and the sustainable food movement needs to look at economic justice if it really wants a way forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's my soapbox.
Yeah. That's a good answer. So there are books for sale, and you should all buy one. And Jonathan will be signing books out there. But with that, I just want to thank Jonathan and just say I'm deeply honored to be able to do this with you, and I really thanks for being here tonight.